Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most dramatic and heartbreaking races in the history of exploration, the race to the South Pole. Two men, two nations, and one frozen continent. On one side, Roald Amundsen, the master of precision and preparation. On the other, Robert Falcon Scott, the British naval officer determined to bring glory to his empire. What followed was a story of triumph, tragedy, and ultimate sacrifice in one of the harshest environments on Earth. So grab a warm drink and let's journey together into the icy heart of Antarctica. The Antarctic plateau lay silent, an endless desert of ice, where the sun burned low against the horizon but never set. Temperatures plunged to levels that froze breath into crystals the moment it left the lungs. The wind howled like a living thing, tearing across the white emptiness with nothing to slow its fury. To set foot here was to court death. Yet in 1911, two men dared to believe that in this frozen world lay the chance to make history. On was a Norwegian, Roald Amundsen, meticulous, unsentimental, a man who had grown up skiing across snowy fields and had long dreamed of making his name as the greatest polar explorer alive. He came armed with careful planning, ruthless efficiency, and a single-minded determination to win. The other was a Briton, Robert Falcon Scott, a naval officer bound by duty, pride, and a sense of destiny. He represented the hopes of an empire at its height, an empire that wanted the last unclaimed prize on Earth. For Scott, reaching the South Pole was not simply an adventure, it was Britain's right, a way to cement national glory in an age when flags were planted as proof of power. Between them lay 900 miles of frozen emptiness. The South Pole itself was nothing more than an invisible spot on the map, a place of no practical value. But in the early 20th century, this blank, untouched point carried enormous weight. To stand at the very bottom of the Earth was to claim ultimate victory in the heroic age of exploration. Neither man could know, as they prepared for the race, that their journeys would lead not only to triumph but also to one of the greatest tragedies in the history of exploration. Amundsen would plant his flag and return home a victor. Scott would push on with grim determination, only to die in the ice with his companions, leaving behind words that still echo through time. The race to the South Pole was not just a contest of distance, it was a clash of two philosophies. Amundsen's reliance on skill, dogs and discipline versus Scott's faith in endurance, machines and human grit. It was a duel between nations, but also between two personalities shaped by different worlds. As the first shadows of the Antarctic summer stretched across the Ross ice shelf, both expeditions prepared to strike out into the unknown. Each step forward would bring them closer to the pole and closer to destiny. At the dawn of the 20th century, the world seemed conquered. Oceans had been crossed, continents mapped, and mountain ranges climbed. Empires stretched across the globe, leaving little untouched by human ambition. Yet one place remained mysterious, unclaimed, and deadly: Antarctica. The southernmost continent was first glimpsed in the early 19th century, but its interior remained impenetrable for decades. The vast ice cap concealed its secrets beneath thousands of feet of frozen silence. Unlike the Arctic, where whaling and trade routes drew explorers northward, Antarctica offered no commercial value. It was barren, isolated, and brutally inhospitable. Its only attraction was glory. By the late 1800s, the so-called heroic age of polar exploration was in full swing. Ernest Shackleton, Fridtjof Nansen, Douglas Mawson, and others became household names, celebrated for their daring. Newspapers breathlessly reported each expedition's progress, while governments quietly encouraged them, knowing that flags planted at remote corners of the globe still carried symbolic power. The South Pole became the ultimate prize. Unlike the North Pole, disputed and surrounded by ocean ice, the South Pole lay on land, a true geographical point that could be physically occupied. Whoever reached it first would go down in history as the conqueror of the very bottom of the Earth. National pride was deeply entwined in the contest. For Britain, still the largest empire in the world, winning the pole seemed almost a matter of destiny. The British public viewed Scott's expedition as a noble undertaking in the tradition of Elizabethan explorers and naval heroes. Meanwhile, for Norway, a small young nation recently independent from Sweden, Amundsen's quest represented a chance to prove itself on the world stage. If a Norwegian flag flew at the pole before any other, it would mark not only personal triumph but national validation. Technology and science also drove the push. These expeditions doubled as research missions, gathering meteorological data, mapping coastlines, and collecting geological samples. But no amount of science could disguise the underlying truth. This was a race, and only one team could win. By 1910, as word spread of Scott's planned expedition aboard the ship Terra Nova, Amundsen secretly prepared his own. The stage was set for a confrontation, not of armies, but of wills, fought not with weapons, but with sledges, dogs, and sheer endurance. The world waited. Somewhere far to the south, beyond the whaling stations and storm-lashed seas, the two men would soon march into a landscape where the margin between life and death was razor-thin. And at the centre of it all lay a single question: who would stand first at the South Pole? Robert Falcon Scott was not just a naval officer, he was a man consumed by a sense of duty, honour and destiny. Born in 1868 in Devon, England, Scott grew up in a family with strong ties to the sea. At 13, he entered the Royal Navy and his career was steady but unremarkable until the late 1890s when polar exploration began capturing Britain's imagination. In 1901, Scott led his first Antarctic venture, the Discovery Expedition. It was a bold, if at times chaotic, attempt to probe the southern continent. Scott and his men pushed further south than anyone before them, enduring months of brutal hardship and learning the unforgiving rhythms of polar life. Despite near disasters, the expedition returned home to Britain as heroes. For Scott, it cemented his reputation. He was no longer just a naval officer, he was a man who had gazed upon the edge of the unknown. Yet Scott also carried away lessons and scars. The Discovery trip revealed both his strengths and weaknesses. He was courageous, determined and meticulous, but he could also be rigid, struggling to adapt when plans unravelled. His reliance on man-hauling sledges, dragging loads by sheer muscle power, left many questioning his judgment, especially when other explorers showed that dogs and skis could be far more efficient. Still, Scott's stoic endurance appealed deeply to British ideals of perseverance and grit. By 1910, Scott had grown restless. He was now a seasoned officer with ambitions greater than the Navy could offer. The South Pole loomed as the ultimate challenge, and Britain, with its imperial pride, seemed destined to claim it. Scott secured funding, organised a crew of carefully selected men, and prepared the ship Terra Nova for the long voyage south. Scott's vision was not just about planting the Union Jack. He insisted that the expedition also serve science. His men would collect biological specimens, chart glaciers, and bring back geological treasures. To Scott, exploration and discovery were inseparable. He wanted the world to remember his journey as more than a race. But beneath the noble intentions, Scott faced immense pressure. He was aware that others were plotting their own expeditions. He also knew the newspapers would follow every development, ready to judge triumph or failure. The South Pole was not only a personal goal, it was a test of Britain's place in the modern world. When the Terra Nova set sail from Cardiff in June 1910, crowds cheered the departing men, waving flags and shouting encouragement. Among the crew were scientists, sailors, and hardy adventurers, each chosen for their skills and loyalty. Spirits were high, but the journey ahead was long, uncertain, and fraught with dangers few could truly comprehend. What Scott did not yet know was that far away in Norway, another man, Roald Amundsen, was quietly preparing to stake everything on the same prize. The stage was set for one of the greatest rivalries in exploration history. While Scott's Terra Nova was already underway, another figure, quiet, cunning, and utterly determined, was preparing a bid for the South Pole. His name was Roald Amundsen, and unlike Scott, he had no illusions about exploration being romantic or noble. For Amundsen, it was about efficiency, survival, and above all, winning. Born in 1872 near Oslo, Norway, Amundsen was raised in a nation where skiing and cold weather endurance were part of everyday life. His childhood was steeped in tales of Arctic hunters and seafarers, and by his early 20s, he had committed himself to exploration. But unlike Scott, Amundsen was not tied to a naval career or the traditions of empire. He was pragmatic, flexible, and above all, obsessed with preparation. His philosophy was simple: study those who had already mastered survival in extreme conditions. He lived with the Inuit in the Arctic, learning their techniques, using dogs, wearing fur clothing, and adopting a low, efficient style of travel. Where Europeans had tried to conquer nature with brute force, Amundsen embraced it, adapting himself and his men to its demands. By 1903, Amundsen had already carved his name into history. Leading a small crew, he became the first to navigate the fabled Northwest Passage, threading through the frozen Canadian Arctic. The journey took 3 years, but it was a triumph of patience and skill. Amundsen proved not just his toughness, but his ability to lead men through years of isolation and hardship. Originally, Amundsen had set his sights on the North Pole, but when news broke in 1909 that Americans Frederick Cook and Robert Peary had both claimed it, controversially, Amundsen recalibrated. If the North was gone, the South remained, and so, with a mix of secrecy and boldness, he changed his plans. In August 1910, his ship, the Fram, set sail officially for the Arctic. But once at sea, Amundsen revealed the truth to his crew. They were going for the South Pole. It was a gamble, and one that risked alienating his backers, but Amundsen's men cheered. They trusted his vision, and they knew his preparation was second to none. Unlike Scott, Amundsen had no grand scientific program. His expedition was focused solely on one thing: reaching the pole first. His men were equipped with carefully chosen sled dogs, nearly 100 of them, and lightweight, expertly designed sledges. They wore furs, not the stiff woolen uniforms of the British. They trained relentlessly in skiing and sledging, understanding that speed and efficiency were their lifelines. While Scott's team wrestled with logistics, Amundsen's base at the Bay of Whales was a model of organisation. His men built comfortable shelters, trained their dogs, and methodically laid supply depots deep into the ice. Every decision was calculated for success. Amundsen himself was driven, but not reckless. He believed in flexibility. If conditions worsened, he would turn back. If dogs had to be sacrificed for food, he would make that choice. To him, there was no shame in pragmatism, only in failure. Word soon reached Scott that Amundsen was also in Antarctica. For the British, it was a shock. What was meant to be a dignified scientific expedition had suddenly become a race. The newspapers would frame it as a duel of nations: Britain versus Norway, tradition versus innovation, stubborn endurance versus calculated efficiency. 2 leaders, 2 philosophies, 1 destination, and only one could plant their flag first. By the Antarctic spring of 1911, the frozen continent was no longer silent. From 2 bases just a few hundred miles apart, rival camps prepared for the same prize, the South Pole. On the Great Ice Barrier, Robert Falcon Scott's British team settled into their huts at Cape Evans. The Terra Nova expedition carried the weight of national pride. Scott's camp buzzed with activity, men cataloguing specimens, making weather observations, and tending to a menagerie of transport animals, ponies, dogs, and experimental motor sledges. It was organised, yes, but also crowded with conflicting priorities. Farther east, at the Bay of Whales, Roald Amundsen's camp was quieter, leaner, and sharper in focus. His men had a single purpose: to reach the pole before anyone else. They trained constantly with skis and dogs, drilling in the techniques Amundsen had borrowed from the Inuit. Their base, Framheim, was warm and well insulated, dug partly into the snow, stocked with carefully rationed food. Where Scott emphasised science, Amundsen emphasised survival. By autumn, both expeditions began laying supply depots across the white emptiness. These caches of food and fuel would determine success or failure on the return journey. Scott's team struggled. The ponies laboured in the soft snow, sinking to their bellies. The motor sledges broke down after only a few miles, their engines choking in the cold. Each mile was a battle, and progress was slow. Amundsen's men, meanwhile, glided across the ice behind their dogs, covering twice the distance in half the time. They erected tall black flags to mark their depots, visible from miles away in the featureless expanse. Every calculation was precise, every movement rehearsed. Still, the Antarctic was no respecter of human plans. Fierce blizzards swept across the ice barrier, pinning men in their tents for days. Temperatures plummeted, frostbite gnawed at fingers and toes, and the vast white horizon offered no mercy. Both expeditions felt the weight of the frozen desert pressing in, reminding them that the South Pole was not simply a prize to be claimed, it was a place that demanded everything in exchange. By the end of October 1911, the stage was set. Amundsen would strike first, launching his push for the pole with 4 men, 4 sledges, and 52 dogs. His strategy was bold but ruthless. Dogs would pull the sledges, and the weakest would be culled along the way to feed the others. And if needed, the men. It was a brutal system, but efficient, and Amundsen had no illusions about sentiment. Scott, still organising his advance, planned a slower march. His polar party would be supported by relay teams, groups that would turn back at set points, leaving a smaller corps to push on toward the pole. He chose ponies and manpower over dogs, believing the animals could endure the cold. It was a decision born of stubbornness, and it would haunt him. As November dawned, the 2 expeditions began their southward marches. Amundsen's men skimmed over the ice, the dogs pulling with rhythmic precision. Spirits were high, and their progress was astonishing. 20, sometimes 30 miles a day. Scott's team, meanwhile, dragged forward in a grinding ordeal. The ponies sweated beneath their loads, their hooves breaking through the crust of snow. Men staggered behind sledges, harnessed like beasts of burden. The motor sledges had already failed completely, abandoned in the snow. Each mile was earned through exhaustion. Newspapers back home followed the race breathlessly. Britain dreamed of its flag fluttering first at the pole, while Norwegians, a small nation on the world stage, longed for their explorer to prove that cunning and preparation could triumph over imperial pride. Out on the endless white plains, 2 small bands of men pushed southward, separated by miles, philosophies, and fortune. Both knew the stakes. Both knew that to falter was to die. The race for the South Pole had begun in earnest. By early December 1911, Amundsen's team was deep into the frozen interior of Antarctica. The vast white plains stretched endlessly, broken only by the looming rise of the Transantarctic Mountains, the jagged barrier standing between them and the pole. To an untrained eye, the mountains seemed impassable, but Amundsen had studied the terrain obsessively, poring over maps and observations from previous explorers. He chose a route up the Beardmore Glacier, a treacherous path riddled with crevasses. For weeks, the men had drilled their dogs in harness, teaching them discipline. Now that discipline saved them. The sledges skimmed over snow bridges, the dogs pulling hard and steady, while the men probed the ice ahead with poles to detect hidden cracks. Each man carried skis, and their movements were swift and practiced. They moved like a machine, honed to precision. The weather favoured them too, clear skies, biting cold, but no crippling storms. Even when they lost dogs to exhaustion, they pressed on, slaughtering the weakest and using the meat to feed the rest. It was harsh, but it kept the team strong. By December 7th, they had reached the polar plateau, a barren expanse, more than 10,000 feet above sea level. Here, the air thinned, the cold deepened, and every breath burned in their lungs. Yet they made astonishing progress, up to 20 miles a day, carving a straight line across the plateau toward their goal. On December 14th, 1911, Amundsen and his 4 companions, Olaf Bjaaland, Helmer Hansen, Sverre Hassel, and Oscar Wisting, finally reached their destination. At 90 degrees south, they stopped, measured their coordinates, and confirmed the truth. They were the first humans in history to stand at the South Pole. The men erected a small black tent, staking it firmly into the snow. Inside, they left supplies and a letter for the British expedition, should Scott arrive and find only silence. Outside, they planted the Norwegian flag, its red, white, and blue standing stark against the endless white horizon. For Amundsen, the moment was a triumph of preparation and will. There was no crowd, no cheering, no music, only the howling wind across the plateau. Yet history had been made. On December 17th, the Norwegians turned north, beginning their return journey. They were in high spirits, their dogs strong, their sledges lightened by consumed supplies. Their strategy had worked flawlessly. Amundsen had gambled everything on efficiency, and it had paid off. Meanwhile, far to the north, Scott and his men were still struggling forward, unaware that the prize they sought had already been claimed. By mid-December 1911, Scott's team had finally begun their push across the polar plateau. The journey had been a brutal trial. They had dragged their sledges up the Beardmore Glacier, a monstrous river of ice riddled with crevasses and swept by avalanches. Where Amundsen's dogs bounded forward, Scott's men hauled with harnesses, their bodies bent under the weight. Each mile was earned in sweat, frostbite, and exhaustion. Scott's reliance on man-hauling reflected his faith in endurance and discipline. The motor sledges had broken down early. The ponies had died or been shot to feed the men. By the time they reached the plateau, only 5 men remained in the final polar party: Scott himself, Edward Wilson, Henry Birdie Bowers, Lawrence Oates, and Edgar Evans. Their sledges were far lighter now, stripped to the essentials, but the strain was merciless. Temperatures plunged below -40 degrees Celsius. Winds scoured the plateau. Freezing fingers and faces raw. Scott's diary entries grew darker. On December 20th, he wrote, "We are tired, weak, and hungry, but there is no turning back now." Still, the men pressed on with stoic determination. Each evening they pitched their tent, cooked meagre rations of pemmican and biscuits, and crawled into frozen sleeping bags, their breath crusting the canvas with ice. Each morning they forced themselves to rise, their muscles stiff and aching, to drag the sledges another mile into the void. On January 16th, 1912, after weeks of torment, the horizon ahead revealed a dark shape, a black tent flapping in the wind. The men trudged closer, dread creeping into their hearts. As they reached it, the sight confirmed their worst fears. The Norwegian flag snapped crisply against the Antarctic sky. Inside the tent, they found supplies and a letter addressed to the King of Norway, left by Amundsen 1 month earlier. Scott wrote in his diary with bitter resignation, "The worst has happened. All the daydreams must go. Great God! This is an awful place and terrible enough for us to have laboured to it without the reward of priority. Now for the return journey." The men had lost the race. Their months of suffering had ended not in triumph, but in the knowledge that history belonged to someone else. And now the hardest part still lay ahead. The return trek of 800 miles. Weakened, demoralised, and battered by worsening weather, they turned north into a fate none of them could escape. When Scott and his men turned back from the South Pole in January 1912, the weight of failure pressed as heavily on them as their sledges. They were exhausted, frostbitten, and demoralised, and unlike Amundsen, they had no dogs left to help them. Every inch northward was carved out of their own dwindling strength. Edgar Evans, the largest and strongest of the group, began to falter first. Weeks of strain had battered him. He fell repeatedly on the ice, striking his head and becoming increasingly disoriented. By mid-February, his condition worsened. On February 17th, 1912, near the foot of the Beardmore Glacier, Evans collapsed for the last time. He died where he fell, his companions unable to revive him. Scott noted grimly in his diary, "A very terrible day. He died quietly, but it was a case of physical collapse." With 4 men remaining, the party pushed onward. The distances between depots seemed endless. Blizzards swallowed days at a time. Their food dwindled to starvation rations. Their fuel ran dangerously low. Their bodies grew thinner, their movements slower. Frostbite gnawed at their fingers and toes. Then came Lawrence Oates, the cavalry officer who had once cared for Scott's ponies. Severe frostbite crippled his feet. Every step was agony, and he knew he was slowing the others. On March 16th, with the men trapped in their tent during a raging blizzard, Oates made his fateful decision. He rose stiffly, pulled on his boots, and looked at his companions. "I am just going outside and maybe some time," he said. Without another word, he stepped into the storm. He never returned. His self-sacrifice gave the others a sliver of hope, one less mouth to feed, but it also broke their spirits further. Scott later wrote, "We knew that poor Oates was walking to his death. It was the act of a brave man and an English gentleman." Now only 3 remained: Scott, Wilson, and Bowers. They staggered north, weaker with each passing day. Their hands were too stiff to handle equipment. Their faces were blistered masks of frost. The blizzards never seemed to end. By late March, they were just 11 miles from the 1-ton depot, a cache of food and fuel that might have saved them. But the weather pinned them down in their tent. Their supplies were gone. They were too weak to move. Scott continued writing in his diary even as death closed in. "We are weak. Writing is difficult, but for my own sake, I do not regret this journey. Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions. His last entry, dated March 29th, 1912, ended with words that still echo through history. For God's sake, look after our people. Sometime after that final note, Robert Falcon Scott, Edward Wilson, and Henry Bowers lay down in their sleeping bags and never rose again. 8 months later, in November 1912, a search party from Scott's expedition found the tent buried in snow. Inside lay the 3 frozen bodies still zipped in their bags. Beside Scott was his diary, the tragic record of one of the most harrowing journeys in exploration. The men who died on the Ross ice shelf never reached home, but their story, written in ice and blood, would outlive them all. The story of Amundsen and Scott is more than a contest of 2 men. It became a symbol of how ambition, preparation, and circumstance can shape history. Amundsen returned to Norway in March 1912 to worldwide acclaim. He had achieved what explorers for centuries had dreamed of: the first footsteps at the South Pole. His meticulous planning, dogs, skis, light sledges, and precision timing became a textbook example of how to survive and succeed in polar exploration. To Norwegians still fresh from independence in 1905, his triumph was more than personal. It was national pride, proof that their small country could achieve greatness. Yet Amundsen's victory was complicated. Though he was celebrated, his success seemed cold and mechanical to many. The drama, the sacrifice, the human struggle, these belonged not to him, but to Scott. When news of Scott's fate reached Britain in early 1913, it sent shockwaves through the empire. The story of his doomed march, the diary entries, and the noble sacrifice of Oates were immortalised as a testament to courage. The British public embraced Scott as a tragic hero, the very embodiment of Victorian and Edwardian ideals, duty, endurance, and honour, even in the face of failure. Schools, monuments, and statues were dedicated to him. The story of Scott of the Antarctic became required reading, inspiring generations. His companions were remembered with equal reverence: Oates, the gentleman who walked to his death; Wilson, the loyal scientist; Bowers, the tireless worker; Evans, who gave everything until he could give no more. But as decades passed, so too did perspectives change. Modern historians have scrutinised Scott's leadership, his reliance on ponies unsuited to the ice, his heavy loads, his limited use of dogs, and his rigid adherence to man-hauling. Some argue that his expedition was doomed from the start, while others defend him, pointing out the unpredictable blizzards and the sheer misfortune that left him trapped only 11 miles from salvation. In contrast, Amundsen's legacy also evolved. Initially overshadowed by Scott's martyrdom, his reputation has risen with time. His efficiency, his use of indigenous knowledge, and his pragmatic style are now recognised as marks of brilliance. Today, he is honoured as one of history's greatest explorers, though his fame never carried the same aura of sacrifice as Scott's. Together, the 2 men's stories created one of the most powerful dual legacies in exploration: triumph and tragedy, precision and endurance, success and sacrifice. The race to the South Pole was not just about who arrived first, it was about the price of ambition, the cost of human limits, and the enduring allure of pushing into the unknown. Even now, more than a century later, when people think of the Antarctic, they often think of 2 names forever intertwined: Roald Amundsen and Robert Falcon Scott. One reached the pole and lived, the other reached it and died, but both secured their place in history, written on the coldest continent on Earth. Thank you so much for watching this incredible story of courage and loss. The race to the South Pole is more than just history, it's a timeless reminder of human determination and the price of ambition. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with friends who love history. And be sure to check out my channel. I'll be adding more fascinating stories every week about exploration, invention, and the people who changed our world. Until next time, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next adventure.